From the book Real Ponies Don't Go Oink, our next chapter is... I have no idea what our next chapter is. Okay, let's try it again. From the book Real Ponies Don't Go Oink, our next chapter is A Good Night's Sleep. Hunters and anglers naturally prefer to carry their own sleeping accommodations right along with them, in the form of sleeping bags, tents, campers, and trailers. But sometimes, however, it becomes necessary to seek out commercial lodging, a circumstance that almost always ends up in trauma. Now, my experience, though, has been that hotel and motel managers, they greatly exaggerate the trauma. I mean, I can accept the screaming and the cry. I can accept the screaming and the swearing, but the weeping, that's a bit much. I recall the last time that Retch Sweeney and Clifford and I flipped our raft while still heading on the Tushwallop River. We made it to shore with most of our gear, but the raft floated off down the river, and we had to pursue it for nearly an hour before we caught up with it. Laughing as we leaped over logs and plowed through brush, we had a great time, even though Clifford did get a nasty gash over one of his eyes when he did hit a branch. He tied a grungy old bandana around his head to sop up the blood and keep it from getting in his eye. One of my pant legs hooked on a knot and tore so badly above the knee that I just ripped it the rest of the way off. Retch Sweeney did a nosedive into the middle of what appeared to be a hog wallow, although there were no pigs about. The mosquitoes and gnats had probably carried them off already. Our faces were smeared with the remains of various blood-sucking insects that we had slapped to death. Obviously shaken by the viciousness of our assault on their legions, some of the smarter insects took cover in our beards and in our hair and fought with us in a guerrilla warfare. Finally, we caught up with the raft. We hauled it to shore and floated the rest of the way down to where we had parked the car. "Whew!" Retch gasped as we tied the raft onto the top of the car. "I must be getting old. These little fishing trips are starting to wear me out." "Gee," Clifford said, "maybe you better see a doctor. A little fishing shouldn't tire a man." "Mm-hmm." "Yeah," I put in. "If something out of the ordinary had happened and we'd had some strenuous exercise, why, I could understand your being a bit tired, but my goodness, Retch, a simple little float trip down the river? Clifford's right. You'd better see a doctor." "Maybe I will," Retch said. "Maybe I will." "And another thing," I said, "we're not going to spend the night out in this rain. Not with you dying and all. We'll get a room at that resort hotel down the road. What was it called?" "The Cutie Poo Resort," Clifford said, trying to squeeze some gorillas out of his beard. Retch didn't object, so we got into the car, and we drove back down to the highway without experiencing difficulty. Well, except for getting stuck in a muddy creek bed. Retch barely had enough strength left to lift the rear end of the car while Clifford stuck some rocks and logs under the tires. The only mishap occurred when the bumper slipped out of Retch's hands and somehow popped all the buttons of his shirt, exposing the rather vulgar tattoo that had mysteriously appeared on his chest during a delightful evening that we had spent in South America with a group of local literary discussing the culture influences of the works of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Luckily, the inscription of the tattoo was in Spanish and could be understood only by a person fluent in that language. The one explanation that we ever came up with for the appearance of the tattoo was that it resulted from the curse of a man who may have been an Indian witch doctor disguised as a German tourist. Retch might unintentionally have offended the witch doctor by using him as a shield while we fought our way to the exit. The locals having taken exception to some of our critical assessments, Retch's wife said that she had some trouble swallowing that theory, but then she had no experience with witch doctors. "That does it," I said. That wasn't it. "That does it," I said to Retch when we got to the highway. We're gonna get a physical checkup first thing after this fishing trip." Nope. Nope. Okay, ready? That does it, I said to Retch. When we get to the highway, you're going to get a physical checkup first thing after this fishing trip. I can understand you letting a car slip out of your hands and dropping it, but not a compact car, for goodness sakes. I know, Retch moaned. I feel weak as a baby. We headed down for the road toward the resort, but before we had gone far, we passed that old country village antique shop. "Stop the car!" shouted Clifford. "Did you see what I just saw? The antique store had a moose head mount in the window. I gotta have it for my den wall." He rushed in and he bought the ratty old thing and stuffed it into the back seat with the dying Retch and the rest of our gear. As the three of us trooped into the lobby of the Cutie Poo Resort, I was struck by the somber, quiet, and sterile atmosphere of the place. It seemed more like a rest home than a resort hotel, as it proclaimed itself to be. I might have been mistaken, but my impression was that the guests in the lobby looked upon us with a good deal of interest, peering up from their bridge games and dominoes. I guess that is what is meant by resort hotel. You have to resort to inane activities to stave off the boredom. The reception desk was unattended. Clifford pounded the bell a few times. When that effort failed to produce a clerk, I shouted, "Anybody home here?" Still no response. At that moment, Retch noticed the shiny black tips of two shoes protruding from a shallow inset in a side wall. The wearer of the shoes apparently had flattened himself into the depression in an unsuccessful effort to conceal himself. For what purpose, I could not imagine. Hey! Hey, you with the shiny shoes!" Retch yelled. "How about a little service here?" The desk clerk then emerged and confronted us with a shaky grin that scarcely made an indent on his overall expression of disdain. "Yes?" he said, peering at us over the top of his spectacles. "Well, we'd like a room," I said, wincing as I leaned down for some frenzied scratching of a few hundred mosquito bites on the extremity from which half of my pant leg had been torn. "Sorry, we're filled up." "Don't give me that," Clifford said, tweaking him on his carnation. "We have a dying man here," and at that moment Clifford began to emit absolutely horrible sounds, finally communicating through wild gestures that one of the gorillas in his mustache had charged up his nostril with a bayonet fixed. "Quick!" I ordered Retch. "Slap him on the back of the head." Retch immediately obeyed and gave Clifford a clout that buckled his knees and sent the gorilla hurtling out into space toward the startled clerk. "Not with the steel head!" I shouted at Retch, who was holding the 12-pounder by the tail in preparation for giving Clifford's head another whack. "You'll bruise its flesh." "I'd bruise Retch's flesh if he wasn't already terminally ill." Nope, that wasn't it either. "I'd bruise Retch's flesh if he wasn't already terminally ill," roared Clifford. They got into a little shoving match. By now the other guests in the lobby had clustered together and retreated to a far corner. They seemed rather a pitiful lot, and I wondered vaguely if they hadn't possibly come to the resort for treatment of a nervous condition. "Please, please, gentlemen," pleaded the desk clerk, who seemed to have the same nervous affliction as his guests. "We don't allow rowdy behavior." "Well, that's good," I replied, "because we have a seriously ill man here, and he needs a good night's rest and some peace and quiet. If you have any rowdies show up, just give us a call. We'll deal with them in a short order. Speaking of short order, we'd like a little grub sent up to our room." "I told you, there is no—" Oh, all right. We do have a room." He scribbled the room rate on the card for me to sign. I stared at the rate card in amazement. Then I realized the rate indicated was merely the clerk's little joke, a bit of absurdity to put us at ease. "Hey, you're not so bad after all," I told him. "That's the funniest thing I've seen all day. You pretending that we want to buy the whole establishment instead of just renting a room for the night." The clerk focused his attention on Retch, as though becoming aware of him for the first time. "What on earth is that?" he asked, wrinkling up his nose, an expression that caused me to mistake the intent of his question. "Well, we think it's pig," I replied. "It might possibly have been a bear wallow he fell into, but my general impression after spending an hour with him in a warm car is that it's pig. What's your guess?" The clerk shuddered visibly. "I was referring not to the odor, but to that rather ghastly tattoo on his chest." "Oh," I said, "that's a real dilly of a tattoo, isn't it? My sick friend here is the only person I know with an X-rated chest. You don't read Spanish, I take?" "No." "Well, good." After handing the steelhead to the clerk and giving him instructions for its proper care, as well as a few tips on how to remove fish scales from a dark suit, we hauled some of our gear in from the car and packed it into the elevator. One of the other passengers in the elevator seemed a bit crabby and expressed his dissatisfaction with having to share an elevator with us and our gear. And I apologized for the slight inconvenience and discomfort that we might be causing him. "The problem is," I explained, "that if we let all the air out of it tonight, we'd waste a lot of good fishing time pumping the raft back up again in the morning." "Buffalo," the man replied, apparently not satisfied with my explanation. "Be careful with that moose head," I warned Clifford. "The horns are messing up the lady's hairdo." "Sorry, ma'am," Clifford said. "This is the first moose I've ever shot, and I like to take it with me wherever I go. Guess I'm just sentimental." We'd had left the raft and moose head at the car, but we didn't want them to get stolen, I explained. "You can't tell what kind of people you'll find in one of these hotels." The man squeezed his head out from behind the raft. "I can't disagree with that," he snapped. From his tone, I judged that he himself had suffered at the hands of some disreputable types in hotels, but as he seemed on the verge of rupturing an important artery, I chose not to pursue the subject with him. The rest of the evening passed without an incident, I'm happy to report. Oh, there was that business with the sheriff and his deputy, but it didn't amount to much. First of all, Clifford headed back to the car to bring in the rest of our gear. As I often told him, he should pay more attention to where he's going. Clutching an armful of gear on his return, he glanced over his shoulder as he walked down the hall behind a lady guest. He later said that he thought that he had heard a noise behind him and expected Retch to be sneaking up to pull some stun on him with the moose head, because that's the sort of thing that Retch likes to do. As far as I know, the lady in the tight evening gown never gave a satisfactory explanation as to why she suddenly stopped and bent over. But I gathered from later testimony that it had something to do with smoothing a wrinkle in her nylons. Now, I have been prodded with the butt end of a fishing rod on occasion, and don't think it anything to raise a great fuss over. But the lady, however, apparently found the experience new and exhilarating, because she emitted a shrill yelp and bounded into the air as though from a trampoline. Clifford, looking back over his shoulder at the time, had no idea he was even involved in the incident, much less the culprit. His first impression was that he was being set upon by a crazy woman intent on flailing him to death with her purse. It is quite understandable, then, that he should attempt to hold her at bay, fencing style, with a section of fly rod. Later that evening, Clifford and I were returning from reviving ourselves in the hotel bar when another minor incident occurred. Well, we had just stepped out of the elevator when Clifford suddenly got the punchline of a joke that I told him an hour before, and he burst out into a loud and unexpected guffaw. The couple ahead of us, dressed to the hilt in evening attire, didn't even look back, but picked up their pace considerably. Just as they were passing a linen closet, a moose stuck its head out and said, "Pardon me, but can you direct me to the nearest restrooms?" "Well, gee, I thought it was you guys," Retch explained. "I heard Clifford laugh." "It was a dumb stunt," I scolded. "That scream almost deafened me." The lady took it pretty well, though, I thought. Retch said, "Well, I think she took it pretty well, too. She probably has a sense of humor, which is more than I can say for her hubby." Well, naturally, both of these incidents were reported to the hotel manager. The clerk came and told us that we would have to leave the premises immediately, but we refused on the grounds that we couldn't possibly take a dying man out into the rain. Retch was contemplating whether he needed a shower, having had one the previous week, when the sheriff and his deputy arrived. They turned out to be pretty good fellows, though. They readily accepted our explanations of the two unfortunate incidents, and then joined us in our room to finish off a fifth of old thumbsucker and exchange a few fishing yarns, both of them now being off duty. The sheriff had a laugh like a bull, and I expected the clerk to come pounding on the door at any instant to hush the lawman up. But not a peep was heard from that strange fellow the rest of the night. An ensuing poker game lasted until 3 in the morning, at which point the sheriff and his deputy had cleaned us out. Every time the sheriff won a hand, which was on the rare occasions his deputy didn't, he let go with a roar that must have caused the other hotel guests to levitate a foot out of their beds. We tried to get the deputy to wrestle Retch for his share of the winnings against our raft, but the deputy said he didn't even want to touch, let alone wrestle a man who had a tattoo like Retch's on his chest. The sheriff said he didn't blame the deputy one bit. Furthermore, if Retch didn't get some buttons on his shirt, he'd have to arrest him for indecent exposure. "What is that, anyway?" the sheriff asked, wrinkling up his face. It's just a little Spanish epigram." "Huh?" the sheriff said. "I could have swore it was a pig." When I woke at 6, Retch Sweeney seemed like his old self once again and demonstrated his fitness for us by doing 100 push-ups. "You want to see me do 100 with my other arm?" he asked, but Clifford and I were convinced that our friend had recovered from his infirmity, both of us remarking with some amazement upon the healing effects of a night of undisturbed sleep in tranquil surroundings. The manager and the clerk were at the checkout desk, as we prepared to depart the premises. They were unshaven and rumpled and appeared to have put in a miserable night, although neither of them volunteered to inform us about the harrowing experience that had reduced them to this pitiful state. Both of them wore terrible smiles, made all the more awful by the uncontrolled quivering of their lips. "Well, it's none of our business," I told them, "but if you fellows are in any sort of trouble, we might be able to help you out. If somebody's giving you a rough time—" No, everything's fine. Just check out and be on your way. Very nice having you gentlemen as guests." "Well, I'll tell you," I said. "We've had a bit of a problem. You see, we got in a poker game with the sheriff and his deputy, and they won all our money. About all we can do is give you our raft here and this fine moose head to boot. They're worth a few $100. "I couldn't think of taking your raft," the manager said, "nor your moose either. We'll just forget the bill. Your visit is on the house, what's left of it." "Well, that's mighty decent of you," Clifford said, but we still got a problem. We're going to be down here fishing for a couple more days. We got a tent to sleep in, but do you suppose you could loan us 20 for eating money?" "Gentlemen," said the manager, "we'd be delighted to loan you 20 for eating money, if it will hasten you on your way." Well, as I like to say, you can't judge a book by its cover, and the same goes for hotels. The manager and his clerk revealed themselves to be real folks after all, and I told them so. I said if any of the three of us was ever in the area on vacation, we'd make a point of staying at their motel. The manager was so taken aback by this sincere expression of appreciation and sentiment that he appeared on the verge of dropping into a dead faint. As we were walking to our car, a busload of new guests arrived. Retch gave the passengers a friendly wave, causing his buttonless shirt to flare open. It created quite an uproar on the bus, many of the passengers shouting vehemently at the driver. The bus screeched out of the parking lot and headed back down the highway, leaving us standing in a cloud of diesel fumes. While I was scratching my head and trying to guess the reason for such peculiar conduct, I happened to notice a banner strung across the portal of the hotel. It said, Cutie Poo Resort welcomes the state's high school Spanish teachers.